For the News and Observer, I'm Dawn Vaughan, Capitol Bureau Chief and host of Under the Dome. You're listening to our latest episode for the week of September 30th, 2024. We're basically here at October, little over a month until the election. I'm joined today by Jason Husser of Elon Poll. Jason is the Assistant Provost for Academic Excellence and Integrity at Elon University, as well as a Professor of Political Science and Policy Studies, and he's the longtime director of the Elon University Poll. Jason, thanks for being on this week.
It's great to be here. I'm always happy to talk about polls, and particularly the ones that I've done.
So polling now, this close to the election, is getting even more attention. We had two stories this week. I wrote about an AARP Commission poll of North Carolina voters. My colleague Daniel Battaglia wrote about your most recent Elon poll. And it's really every day as things draw nearer. It's not just the candidates obviously want to pay attention to the polls. Josh Stein, the Democratic Attorney General candidate for governor, called it the polar coaster. I'm sure you have too. Maybe in polling world, people say that about the range of polls. So tell me about the timing of polls when we're this close, because in a primary, it's different. That's like more indications of what people are interested in or on issues other times of year. But now that we're getting closer and closer to Election Day and the finish line, and even then it's not too close, because these two most recent polls about Stein versus his Republican opponent, Lieutenant Governor Mark Robinson, those polls only wrapped up like maybe a week or so ago, but it still wasn't after the Robinson scandal that with all the fallout going there. So what's the difference with poll results now compared to a different time in the campaign cycle?
Well, the poll results take a good bit of time in the field, because either, depending on your mode, you're either calling actually about 100,000 people often to talk to 1,000 people, or you're doing a lot of outreach via email, if it's a email-based survey, or text messages. Some polls that are face-to-face, which is still the highest quality poll, those can take months to complete. What we're really in the cycle of right now is horse race polling, because that's where the consumer demand is. I have a lot of reservations about horse race polling in terms of its intellectual value and its value to society, but people want a sense of what's happening. Right now in the cycle, I was just checking out one average, and we've had about 20 polls done in the last 6 weeks in North Carolina. North Carolina is a very heavily polled state. Pennsylvania is another one of those states. And it's increasingly, we're seeing more and more major national news outlets doing polling in North Carolina. A few of us university pollsters here at Elon University, we are one, High Point University, Meredith College, ECU. We're around year-round, all 4 years of the cycle, not just at the end. And we're really interested often much more on what issues are happening in North Carolina, what the General Assembly is doing, what people might care about in the off cycle. It might not even be election related, just may be important for society. The state we're in right now is one in which there's a lot of outside organizations coming into North Carolina, giving us an idea of what's happening in the election in terms of who's up, who's down, but not necessarily that much detail on what voters really want to happen after the election.
So what are those driving issues now?
Right now, the key issue for most voters across the country is the economy. The economy is perpetually that big issue, but we're in an odd race in terms of issues because things are so polarized, and particularly, I think, because of the nature of our current political climate. We've moved often from conversations about issues to conversations about personality. In some ways, this is a campaign at the presidential level about who can do the right insults that they think might move the needle or appeal to their base the most, much less so about talking about details of policy. We saw that evidence of that in the last debate between Harris and Trump, in which Trump really couldn't answer the question about healthcare, but he certainly had a lot to say about Harris's personality and character.
How does this election compare to not necessarily national, but statewide office or other things that you all poll, where there isn't such a stark difference in the candidates? Has, at what times where it has been more about policy versus people's, immediate response to what they think of Trump or not?
I've been polling in North Carolina for a while now. Started in 2012, polled in 2014, 16, 20, now in 24. And we've been doing 6 to 8 polls a year since then. The 2012 election was particularly policy oriented. Barack Obama, as the first Black president of the United States, that did have personality components to it. Mitt Romney as a Mormon running for office. There was a number of identity-based things coming up among the electorate. But really, since the rise of Trump, things have moved more and more about the personalities of the opponent and personalities in the race, at least in what campaigns are putting forward, and what we've seen in the past. If you go back to like the Nixon-Kennedy debate in 1960, they were mainly talking about what they would do after they were elected in terms of governing itself. Very little conversation about their personal characteristics. And so as America has gotten more polarized, we're seeing more and more conversations, at least among political campaigns and political elites, about characteristics of the opponent rather than characteristics about what they may do for society.
Why do you think that shift has happened?
I think a lot of it has to do that people are thinking in these highly partisan terms, much like one talks about a sports team. So it's much easier, I think, for people to talk about their opponent and their positions when it's in terms of them as people. Because most of our public policy problems are wicked problems in the sense that they're not that easy to disentangle. When you think of things like healthcare in the United States, that's a multi-trillion-dollar question with tens of thousands of actors, millions of actors, actually, lots of different solutions, none of which are panaceas. It's much harder to go on television and make the case about that than it would be to make the case of this person's a jerk.
Mm-hmm. So the two polls, the AARP Commission poll that they had done by this bipartisan team, looked at voters 50 and older, but also younger voters, and looking at North Carolina, especially for the older voters, economic issues again, but maybe more, dialed in if they're, caregivers for their elderly parents, things like Social Security, Medicare, cost of housing, utilities, that sort of thing. And it shows, again, the drivers of, younger voters are pushing Harris and Jeff Jackson for Attorney General, but, depending on how all of that balances out. What did you see in your most recent poll about where voters are on the presidential race and the North Carolina races in particular?
In terms of the horse race itself in North Carolina, we found that this remains a race that is far too close to call. This started out as a close race. Harris moved the race to be more competitive when Biden was really lagging behind in North Carolina as well as the rest of the country. People were talking, well, North Carolina is not a swing state this cycle. Harris's entry to the race, the party's embrace and surrounding of her, lifting her up, has led to her making it a traditional North Carolina, basically a 50-50 race. Our specific numbers showed Harris was up by less than 1 point, 0.7%. She was over Trump 46 to 45 with 4% of undecided voters. On the governor's race, however, if you had told me it was going to be where it is now, like a year ago, I would have been shocked. I thought North Carolina's governor's race was going to be one of the most competitive in the country. It was going to have some of the most money spent on the race. What we're finding, though, is that Stein is very far ahead. We found a 14-point lead for Josh Stein over Mark Robinson. And the key thing about that is it's not that Josh Stein is that popular. His numbers look a lot like Roy Cooper's numbers did. The story of that race is that Mark Robinson is deeply unpopular.
All right. We're going to take a quick break. And when we come back, we're going to talk more with Jason Husser of Elon University Poll, and a little bit about how polling is actually done, and then our picks for headliner of the week. We'll be right back. We were talking before the break, we're back here and Under the Dome, about how Robinson in the governor's race in North Carolina as an unpopular candidate, and Jason Husser from Elon University Poll. That's still even before this most recent news, which Robinson denies, and his staff resignations and everything. That all of those polls were done before this, right? Just wanted to make that clear.
That's right. Our poll showing Robinson 14 points behind was before the news broke. That poll is our numbers were, I think, more negative towards Robinson than the average. The average currently is that Robinson is 10 points behind Josh Stein. Either way, that's a huge gap. I do think that the scandal will drive Robinson's support down, but Robinson was already so low that I don't know how much more movement there was that was possible, because people who were going to vote for Republican regardless of what happened, they're probably still going to stick with Robinson. Where I think it matters are those loosely attached Republicans and those independent leaning Republicans. Many of them had already abandoned Robinson. Where I think it matters now is that they had not necessarily abandoned the Republicans at the state legislative level. And some of Robinson's negativity may bleed over into that. We're currently in the field with another poll right now that'll be out later in October, that we have some questions trying to gauge just what effect this Robinson scandal might have had.
That's the worries I'm hearing from Republicans now with the rest of the ballot. They're worried that he'll bring, Trump down in North Carolina top of ticket, but that also have like a lot of negative impact on, of course, all 170 seats are up in the General Assembly, the Council of State, judges, local elections, all of it, where people will punish the rest of the party for a candidate, and depending on what the candidate's response is to Robinson or something else someone else they don't like. I want to talk about how you get people to talk and the difference between your poll versus other polling, because anybody can say, well, I polled the 10 people on the street just now, and how that's different than what you all do, how you get the sample size, who's in it, that sort of thing.
Great. Well, without going into too much historical detail, let's go back to like 1930s, 1940s. The early polls were often opt-in polls from often newspaper or magazine subscriptions. So this Literary Digest poll that said Dewey defeats Truman led to newspapers printing the wrong result on the election. At that point, we weren't really in the stage of scientific sampling. George Gallup was a major innovator in polling. And eventually what became the most dominant type of polling in the United States were telephone-based polling, particularly random digit dial telephone polling. And that made a lot of sense back then, because almost every household had a telephone. Not all of them, but most households with a voter had a telephone in them, which meant you could reach the household. There was typically one telephone per household. Those of us who grew up in a landline era remember that. That all changed when caller ID was invented, when mobile access was invented, but particularly caller ID. What ended up happening to polls is that their response rates cratered. We could do really good sampling via telephone polls. In 1997, a little over 1 in 3 people we would call as pollsters would talk to us. This is data from the Pew Research Center. So when I say we, I mean the people at Pew in 1997, not me personally. That started falling around 2000. So went from 36% in 1997 to 28% response rate in 2001. And by the time 2009 had come around, it was down to 15%. And then by 2018, it was down to 6%. This largely tracks my much shorter track record of 13 years roughly of doing this, where we went from about a 15% response rate, so 1 in 6 numbers we'd call would answer, to when I stopped doing telephone polling in the pandemic, where we were calling oftentimes 50 people in order for one to talk to us. So, and sometimes as much as 100 people. So to do a poll of 1,000 respondents, we would be needing to make 50,000 to 100,000 phone calls, which became just logistically and cost prohibitive to do. Where most polling has moved, not all, but most polling has moved, is using online recruitment. we recognize that the internet is the dominant form of communication for most people, either via email, via Zoom. Most people are communicating in some sort of online platform, and most households have internet access. Maybe not high-speed internet in terms of cable internet, but most have some kind of mobile device. And so pollsters have increasingly found ways to get people to take surveys online. Sometimes that can mean they're recruited offline. So they get snail mail sent to their residential address. They're sampled from the list of households that the post office knows existed. And then they're moved online. Sometimes they're recruited by internet advertisements, by incentive programs. What is, I think, the new era of polling is really trying to figure out how can we make representative samples without randomization. And so polls are all over the place and how they're being conducted in terms of mode now. Some are done on telephone, a few that's largely a dead field. There's still a few face-to-face, door-to-door surveys, which can be extremely high quality and also extremely expensive. But the dominant form of surveying now is done on online surveys. And within that category of online surveys, there's quite a few different ways of going about it. What I am often more concerned about is less so the mode, but what's the ultimate sample composition?
Okay. So how do you always have the same time frame and thinking, well, if you want this number of Republicans and Democrats, that it takes longer one versus the other?
Where we run into sort of timing issues and differential effort required is often has to do with age. Back when I was a telephone pollster, we would run into an issue where it was much harder to get people under 40 on the phone, but it was much easier to get people over 65. Now is the inverse issue. It's much easier to get people under 40 on the internet, but it's much harder to get people over 65 in online surveys. That's also has a gender component. Older men are some of the hardest groups to reach online, but it's still done. It's still doable. The test that I often use for polls in terms of sample quality is really looking at their demographics to see the proximity of what their demographics look like to what we know as population parameters. And so the population parameters would be things taken from primarily the U.S. Census Bureau, but also other sources. It could be some Federal Reserve numbers related to home ownership. It could be, if we're talking about election polls and registration polls, statistics gathered by the North Carolina State Board of Elections. And so to make sure that sample ends up looking like the population is supposed to look like. Where I think the dominant area of polling now is moving into, rather than true random samples, it's moving into something much closer to what would historically been called a quota sample, where you create a bunch of quotas of buckets of demographic categories throughout whatever population of interest, and you're trying to fill those quotas as you go along and manage that. And then after you do that, you still may not have the greatest sample. And then what you have to then do is statistically manipulate the sample to weight it. So you count some people as more than others.
Okay. Well, I'm especially interested in this October poll, and we'll see that since my beat is the governor's race primarily, how that plays out closer to the election. I'm sure we could talk about polls longer, but we're about out of time. I wanted to get to our picks for headliner of the week. Jason, I'll start with you. Who or what is your headliner of the week?
The hurricane coming through the middle of the South right now, I think, is the big story on my mind, definitely on the minds of lots of North Carolinians, is we're getting school cancellation notices. And it brings back memories of Hurricane Sandy, which may have impacted the Barack Obama election in 2012.
Okay. So we're recording this late Thursday afternoon. When people listen on Monday, well, hopefully the aftermath isn't that terrible with flooding and everything else. My headliner is something that a little impacted by the weather, but it looks like pretty much the storm isn't gonna hurt Raleigh that much, other than just rain. This is the last year of the International Bluegrass Festival being hosted in Raleigh. It's leaving the state next year, and they have in addition to the concerts, they have a downtown street festival on Fayetteville Street right outside the NNO office, which is usually a pretty cool thing to to check out, but we'll see how much the weather has an impact on that. And you don't always think about Raleigh and bluegrass together, but this festival made people think about it. So there's that. The Sir Walter Raleigh statue was wearing a banjo when I came in Thursday morning in front of the convention center. So I'll end on the musical note. All right, that's it for us. Thank you, Jason Husser from Elon University Poll, for being on. I'm Dawn Vaughan for the News and Observer. We'll talk to you next time.
Thank you.